Anna Freud had set up a clinic, a very large clinic in London, to deal with expected cases of shell shock. And in the great crisis of Dunkirk and the evacuation of France, when London too was under the force of the Blitz, to everybody's astonishment, there were very, very few cases of shell shock. And the reason seemed to be that there was no escape from the situation. In other words, under circumstances of warfare where you could be evacuated, where you could go home and get out of it, people succumbed to shell shock. That is to say, there was a choice. You could possibly get out of this thing. And if you could get out of it, there was anxiety. Shall I stay in or shall I stay out? Anxiety always surrounds a decision. But under the later circumstances, there was absolutely no way of getting out of the trouble. Blighty or home was just as much under bombardment as the front line. There was no escape from the situation at all, and therefore in this sense you knew you were damned. You knew you had to endure this. There was no way of getting out. And so the cases of shell shock didn't occur. It was only saying, simply an observation on human psychology, that we have a certain preference for certainty, even if the certainty be dismal and horrible, over uncertainty as to whether we are going the happy way or the way of horror. Now, the prophet, the preacher, in pointing out the possible doom of horror, creates precisely this state of uncertainty. Because he is saying, if you will do these things, you can avoid it. If you will do your duty, if you will do the will of God, if you will follow the course of reason, you will get out of this situation, which he proceeds to depict in the most vivid terms that he can in order to terrorize people into being reasonable. But it seems to me that, as I've already suggested, over the whole history of the use of this kind of propaganda, that there is absolutely no evidence to commend it as an effective tool. People are more fascinated by the description of doom than they are dissuaded from it. And I think all of those who are interested in persuading human beings, in trying to establish the counsels of reason, ought to recognize at this point in history that the technique of old-fashioned prophecy, the technique of preaching, simply has not worked. I suppose we can take a lesson from the advertising people. Probably those advertisements which attract and promise something highly desirable are more effective than those which utter warnings. It's true, of course, that people will be persuaded, say, to fork out tax money under circumstances of national danger, rather than in times of peace. Fear somehow unites human beings to do things. In the words of the poet Lawrence Binyon, in a rather sentimental poem about the First World War, he says, "The cares we hugged dropped out of vision. Our hearts with deeper thoughts dilate. We stepped from the days of sour division into the grandeur of our fate." But those are poems which praise the virtues of action when it's all too late. Action in the circumstances of a crisis which can no longer be avoided. A crisis into which we have fallen, and our falling has not been prevented, but perhaps assisted by all the talk of the doom for which we were headed. Now, it seems to me that this theory of persuasion rests on another theory that's less conscious. It rests ultimately on the theory that there is a divorce between human reason and human passions. That, in other words, the instinctual or organic or physiological organization of man is something, on the one hand, which is inherently selfish and stupid, but that somehow or other we have been endowed with a faculty of reason opposed to the stupid and blind cravings of the organism. And that the task of being civilized is to make the blindness and the passions of the human organism responsive to the voice of reason. Now note this, that although this is a current attitude, a current feeling about man's nature and man's task, that when the prophet speaks, he doesn't speak entirely with the voice of reason. He appeals to fear. And a great deal of his argument consists not really in argument, in rational discourse at all, but in the depiction of horrible consequences of things that may happen if we don't do what's reasonable. Very, very rarely is the prophet a lover of mankind, in the sense, every lover, in the sexual sense of the word, is a wooer. And very rarely, hardly ever in the whole literature of philosophy and religion, does one come across a prophet who, instead of warning, instead of trying to change people by threatening them, tries to change them by wooing them.